My name is Tammy Bomick, and I'm the board chair for FOSI, as well as the VP of Civility at Roblox. I am thrilled to welcome you all here today. Thanks for taking time out of your busy days to join us. For those of you who are not yet familiar with FOSI, FOSI is a nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to making the online world safer for kids and their families. Today, FOSI is leaning into its role as a convener, bringing together leading voices in children's online safety to discuss significant updates and chart a path forward for nuanced and informed public policy. As a third-generation Californian, I'm proud of my home state for taking this subject seriously. Last year, Roblox welcomed the work on the age-appropriate design code to make online experiences for young people safer and more private by default. As we've also endorsed a bill that seeks to address the growing scourge of children's sexual abuse material online, including when it's generated by AI. Improving online safety for all Californians requires innovation, nuanced and evidence-based policies, and honest collaboration between all stakeholders. Now, before we turn it over to an in-depth panel discussion with our local experts, I'm actually going to turn it over to Marissa to share a little bit more about our keynote speaker and take it from there.
Thank you so much, Tammy.
Thank you, Marissa.
Thank you, Tammy, for setting the stage for us, and thank you all for being here at FOSI Briefs the States, a golden opportunity for online safety. I am joined by some phenomenal panelists that I will make sure to introduce you all to and that we will hear from briefly. But just to cover a few housekeeping rules, there will be a question and answer period at the end of this panel discussion, so please hold on to your questions and we'll be sure that we get to them during the Q&A period. And if you can't, if we don't have the time to get to it during that period, please stay behind, because immediately following the panel discussion, we will have a networking reception and our panelists and speakers will be delighted to speak with you during that portion of the event today. So I am Marissa Edmond, the Policy Specialist at the Family Online Safety Institute, and I am joined by Holly Grosshans of Common Sense Media, Larry Magid from connectsafely.org, Nicole Rocha from Rocha Public Affairs, and Matt Soth from All Tech is Human. We will be joined briefly in a minute by Assembly Member Josh Hoover. During that time, we will have to pause our panel discussion so that he can provide our keynote address. So thank you in advance for your patience while we get situated. But before then, we can just go ahead and get started. So I wanted to start, we can start immediately to my left with Holly, and then we can go down the row. Why is California such a critical state to have this conversation in online safety? We heard briefly from Tammy around the age-appropriate design code that was passed first in California, which it was a bill that came from the UK and it passed there. And California has no shortage of legislation related to online safety. So why is California such a critical state to talk about these issues? And then speak a little bit about the work that you do in California into these issues.
Sure. So thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. California has long been seen, as you all know, as leaders in the tech industry. And so also, California is seen as leaders in policy, privacy policy and tech policy, and holding tech accountable with the age-appropriate design code passing here in California. And we think that the privacy bills like the Erasure Bill and CCPA are obviously really, really important laws here in California. But at Common Sense Media, we also see that our research shows that although that social media is, in particular, is a great place for community building for children, or I'm sorry, for teens, and for many communities, but we also see that there's a lot of support right now, bipartisan support across the country from parents, from educators, to hold tech accountable. So we think that that's why it's a really great place to hold tech accountable here in California, where there is so much leadership already with privacy. We don't see that privacy and children's online safety are mutually exclusive ideas, so that they can both work together. And we really feel that this is a great time to create legislation that holds tech accountable and makes the online environment safer for all kids.
So I grew up in Los Angeles during the 50s and 60s, and my dad had a law office on the corner of Hollywood and Vine. So because of the entertainment industry, I was convinced that I lived in the center of the universe. And many years later, I'm still convinced I live in the center of the universe, but now it's because of the tech industry. Google, Meta, Snap, TikTok, Discord are all located in California. I'm sure I'm leaving out a lot of important companies that will be affected by the design code. What happens in California impacts the entire globe. When you think about all of the legislation and legal actions that go on in Europe, for example, in many cases it's because they are reacting to policies that are made in California, not by Californians as a state, as a people, but by companies based in California. So for that reason alone, California is a very, very important part of that. Beyond that, I would certainly agree with what my colleague from Common Sense Media said about a state that is not shy about proposing and passing legislation, some of which is very good, some of which not so good, but the point is we have a very active legislature, and although I don't believe anything's come up in the proposition category on this, correct me if I'm wrong, we even have mechanisms in California where any citizen can propose a proposition that could become part of the Constitution and become law. So we are a state where policy is a very important part of how we live. Beyond that, we're a lovely place to live and a great place to have events. So thank you very much, FOSI, for coming to California and bringing the event here.
Thank you so much.
So my name is Nicole Rocha, and my background is started in the legislature. So I first worked with the Senate Judiciary Committee, analyzing issues that affected children, and eventually tech and privacy policy. And I was part of Team CCPA when it was passed in 2018 under Ed Chow. Why is California the right place to do this? So we have legislators who have been completely steeped in privacy policy and tech policy for a very long time. They understand the nuances. No one's afraid to take these issues head on. We also have one of the longest legislative sessions in the entire country. And if democracy works the way it is supposed to, which I have faith that it will, we can actually vet these issues. We can have disagreement. We can have all of the stakeholders participate in these conversations and come up with policies that both protect children and allow for the innovation that California is known for. So this is the state to do it in. It's also incredibly diverse and large, and if you can do something in California, you can roll it out to other states and you can roll it out nationwide. California also, in addition to being a leader on tech issues, is a leader on children's rights. We are one of the first states that allowed children as young as age 12 to consent to mental health treatment and things like that. And so it's the place to be. It's the place to try out these policies, get a conversation going, and see how we can do the best things for kids and innovation.
Yeah, my job's easy. I just get to agree with everybody. That's the beauty of being last. There's some great points there. So my initial background before I got into tech was working in education as a high school teacher administrator for 15 years. And you know, in that same window we talked about these laws being passed, I spent a lot of time working on looking at schools' tech adoption, and you had COPPA and SIPA, Child Learning Protection Act, were some of the first rules that schools really had to enforce. And we've seen in that same window, whether it's ed policy, education standards, ed code, that all became sort of integrated into the school system. What was happening in California was really guiding and driving what was happening in a lot of other states across the country. Even textbook development, right? Like whoever the biggest state, California, Texas, and then they designed textbooks for the other states so they would just adopt those similar standards. So within that, with the legislative session being very forward thinking, having all the tech companies here, it just kind of makes sense that people would be more open to these conversations because we're around it all the time and we're exposed to it on a consistent basis. So having these higher level considerations and going from the, oh wow, this tech is really neat, to like, oh my gosh, like what are we going to do with this, is just a natural occurrence, I think, that fits very well in our state.
Amazing. Thank you all so much for setting the stage for us, and we could not have timed this more perfectly. I would like to welcome our keynote address for today, Assemblymember Josh Hoover. Thank you so much for joining us.
Want me over here?
Yes, please.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. Sounds like we have a number of great experts here today, so I'm sure they're going to be able to fill in a lot of the gaps. But I wanted to talk a little bit about some of my background and the things that I'm working on in the legislature right now. My name is Josh Hoover. I'm the relatively new Assembly representative from District 7, which is Northeast Sacramento County. Prior to my time in the State Assembly, I actually served on a school board in my local community, Folsom Cordova Unified School District. And I'm also a father of 3. And so online, obviously privacy issues as well as making sure that kids are safe online is a very high priority for me in the legislature. And, I think just given, it was interesting when I ran initially for the school board in 2018, I think the first thing that my first goal was to ensure that all of our board meetings were live streamed and available to the public so that parents could better engage in the process. We got that passed with bipartisan unanimous support. We had teachers union and support. We had parent support. And I thought, this job is really easy. It's going to be really, really easy to get things done in this place. And little did I know what was coming for us in 2020 with the pandemic. And the pandemic really did change a lot of things and in a lot of ways forced a lot of kids online who maybe weren't on there before to that degree. And so it was very difficult to navigate that and making sure, obviously, that we were continuing to educate students. I also fought to make sure that our kids got back to in-person instruction as soon as possible. But really just, it really did change the way that we interact with the internet and really forced a lot more, obviously, remote work and things online, remote schooling. And so definitely something that I think we will continue to monitor. But that is kind of the backdrop to what led me eventually in 2022 to joining the legislature and really continuing to work on these important issues. I really see the safety of kids online as a key issue moving forward, particularly with the increase in, obviously development and increase of social media use among our young people. I think it's really important that we're striking the right balance when it comes to obviously allowing for parents to engage in that process, but also making sure that we have the proper limitations and also regulations on companies that are obviously marketing to our children and doing other things as well. So, the other thing I'll mention too is another big crisis that I have been working on. We're losing over 110 Californians per week to fentanyl overdoses in California. This is something that the legislature has been working to tackle through. We've passed legislation to educate parents and educate teachers on how to respond to overdoses. And I myself am working on legislation to require Narcan in all of our schools. It's something I pushed for at the local level before joining the legislature, and also adding penalties to those who would traffic fentanyl in our communities. But a big place where kids get access to fentanyl is online, is through social media, is through, as with everything good, the internet has brought a lot of good and a lot of amazing things to the fore, but it also has a lot of harmful effects if used for the wrong purposes. And so continuing to work on those pieces of legislation. My main bill this year, my main effort is I have legislation that is passed the Education Committee and is currently in the Appropriations Committee to continue to move the needle on limiting cell phone use in our schools. And so essentially all the bill would do is require school districts across the state to pass a policy on cell phone use. Now, there's a lot of flexibility within that. Every school district's going to get to have their own local conversation on that. My previous school district and the work that I started at my school district is we banned cell phone use completely in elementary school. We limited it pretty substantially in middle school, and then we limited it a little less substantially in high school. Since I have left, they've gone even farther. They're trying to increase the limitations in middle and high school. And so there's a lot of work being done in districts across the state on this topic. And there's a lot of different ways to approach this issue. My school district, as well as a number of districts across the state, have invested in yonder pouches where kids actually go to school and they place their phone in a pouch and they keep it in their possession for the day, which addresses enforcement and liability concerns for taking phones, but it also restricts access to those phones during the school day. A lot of districts have found that to be very effective, but there's also other ways to do it as well. My kids' school, for example, simply has a policy that it must be often in your backpack, right? So it's not necessarily in a pouch, but they have enforcement policies in place to make sure that phones aren't being used during the school day. Obviously, my kids complain a lot about that policy, but they follow it. And what we're seeing at the local level, and what I'm hearing from my administrators in Folsom Cordova Unified in my district, is that they have seen just a tremendous increase in social interaction on their school campuses, a tremendous increase in students actually playing games and hanging out with each other at lunchtime, which I think is a really important part of the human experience that, as amazing as smartphones are, they are certainly interrupting some of that interaction. And so really, we'll continue to work on this bill. I just met recently with the Appropriations Chair, Assemblymember Buffy Wicks, who also cares deeply about issues relating to social media and cell phone use. And so we're hoping that that'll get out of appropriations and continue moving forward. It has I'm the lead author, but it also has two key Democratic joint authors in Assemblymember Josh Lowenthal and Assemblymember Almer Asuci, who actually introduced a similar bill in 2019 to allow districts to do this. And now we're trying to make sure districts are going to be required to have this conversation at the local level. In addition to that, I don't know if you want me to answer any questions or anything, but essentially, there's a lot of other legislation I'm sure is going to be discussed on this panel relating more directly to social media specifically. I know that there's a lot of different conversations going on in that regard as well. Social media use obviously continues to be a priority too for myself and a number of my colleagues when it comes to making sure that companies are obviously being responsible when it comes to kids online and social media use. And so we'll continue to work on those issues as well. But I really appreciate you having me today, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
We really
Sure.
appreciate you. Thank you so much, Assemblymember Hoover, for prioritizing these issues, and we would be happy to have you answer questions during the Q&A portion if you're happy to stay around. Thank you so much. I think you mentioned the critical role that all parts of industry, parents, families, and as we're here to talk about, policymakers play in ensuring that the online world is safe for children and families. Today, we're here to talk about the ways that policy impacts online safety. In California, I think one of the most notable pieces of legislation that has come out is the age-appropriate design code. It is currently enjoined in California, but it has continued to garner attention around it being a path forward towards implementing online safety in policy for children. So Nicole, I know you were very critical in the development of the age-appropriate design code. Can you, for those of us that don't know, could you speak a little bit to the intention of the age-appropriate design code and what it aims to do?
Sure. So I think a lot of the legislation we have seen to protect kids online over the past decade or so, a lot of it was reactionary. Something bad would happen to a kid or some kids, and then there would be a bill to try and stop that, right? And the different thing about the age-appropriate design code is it is intended to be a comprehensive framework to prevent the harm from happening in the first place. And so in the most basic terms, I would say it is high privacy for kids by default and safety by design. One of the things that is so different from about the age-appropriate design code when you compare it to like COPPA is that COPPA would apply to any site or app where there is actual knowledge that a user is a child, or if it's directed to children. The age-appropriate design code is broader than that, in that it is intended to apply to any sites or apps that are likely to be accessed by children. So it actually protects kids where they hang out. And if you're a site that's likely to be accessed by children, you need to have strong data minimization policies in place for kids. And then you also need to do a risk assessment of your online services, products, and features to make sure that they're not going to foreseeably harm the kids that access your site. And so that's it in a nutshell, and I'm happy to answer more questions about that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, the one other thing I would say is it applies to youth up to the age of 18, unlike COPPA, which applies to youth up to the age of 13.
Amazing, thank you so much. And I think a lot of folks in this industry see the age-appropriate design code as a path forward, but unfortunately it has seen some, it has been blocked in the courts, and due to some First Amendment concerns. And we've also seen some folks have issues with the term age-appropriate and what that means for different people. So I'm curious, Matt or Larry, if you could speak to some of these potential unintended consequences of the age-appropriate design code, and how the path towards implementation is, as we've seen, an uphill battle. And can you speak a little bit to that?
Well, I mean, I actually had to look it up. I had written an editorial. I wrote a newspaper column for the Mercury News. It also appears in other papers around the state. And I actually endorsed I had forgotten that I had written a very positive review of the age-appropriate design code when it was first proposed. Although in my article, I had some concerns. And at that point, there were more questions because the bill was at its infancy. So perhaps Nicole can elucidate, whether my concerns were well-founded or not. First of all, on the positive side, I love the fact that it actually prohibits sites from failing to disclose if a parent is monitoring their children's activity. I hate stealth monitoring. I have some issues about monitoring in general, but if you're going to monitor your children's behavior, I think it has to be transparent. They need to know they're being monitored for a lot of reasons, including if you find something that concerns them and you bring it up, you can have the conversation about what you found rather than have the conversation about whether you monitored them, because that should have been decided in the beginning. I also am a big fan of data minimization, by the way, not just for children, but for all of us, and I think that it behooves every site that collects data to collect the data that's necessary, and sometimes that may be necessary for financial reasons to monetize the service, and I'm okay with that, possibly, as long as they're very transparent. But the collection of data, I never understood why a flashlight app needed your location data. That's a sort of a famous example of a misuse of certain kinds of data. I am a little concerned about age estimation. I have been involved in this issue of age assurance, age verification, going back many years. It was, I think, 2004, about 20 years ago, or maybe 18 years ago, when 49 attorneys general and MySpace entered into an agreement to create a commission to investigate age verification that was coordinated by the Harvard Berkman Center, and I was pleasure to be one of the members of that commission, and we spent an entire year studying it, and at that point could not come up with any method for verifying ages that didn't further violate privacy rights or violate actual privacy laws like the protection of Social Security data or school data. It also gets very tricky. It's easy to estimate the age of an adult if they have a credit rating or other documentation, driver's license. It's very difficult to estimate the age of a child who probably doesn't have credit and may not have even any official state ID other than perhaps a birth certificate or a Social Security number, a card, or school records, again, all of which are protected for privacy purposes. There are some promising technologies that we've talked about, including biometrics. Again, perhaps I can be elucidated in the specifics of the design code, but I believe it kind of leaves it vague and open as to age verification or age assurance or age estimation, whatever it's called. Another concern is this notion of a site that is attractive to children. Well, the Super Bowl is attractive to children. Millions of children watch the Super Bowl. Yet there are commercials that run in the Super Bowl, not to mention what happens on the field or what happens during halftime, but there are commercials that run in the Super Bowl which I would argue are probably not appropriate for young children, Yet parents have the opportunity, if they choose to allow their children to watch the Super Bowl and watch those commercials. And I'm sure many millions of children do watch the Super Bowl and do watch those commercials. And so you need to be thoughtful as to what that means about a site that's likely to be visited by children. That could be a vast number of sites. I also have some concerns about what is considered appropriate content when it comes to health, reproductive information that ought to be in the hands of sexually active or sexually curious teens. I wouldn't want to see any blocking of that kind of material. Material that might help somebody who is part of a marginalized community, whether that be sexual orientation, or whether it be gender, what gender choices or issues, whether it be religious, whether it be political. I'm concerned about the protection of children's rights, even vis-a-vis their own parents, as well as their privacy, even vis-a-vis their own parents, because there are cases where a child might be exploring something, just as Nicole mentioned, California does protect children's ability to seek mental health care. I believe it also protects children's ability to get reproductive care.
Starting at 12.
Starting at 12, again, irregardless of their parents' feelings. So I think we need to make sure that whatever legislation we consider, and right now I'm not talking just about the age-appropriate design code, I'm talking about a lot of proposed legislation, including some on the federal level, and certainly legislation that's being passed in other states, which has the risk of violating the rights of children. And then finally, although I have not studied in any detail the Net Choice First Amendment case regarding the age-appropriate design code, I certainly agree that we need to very carefully explore any impact on free speech of any legislation, including the free speech of minors. I have read the First Amendment many, many times, and I have never noticed any clause in it that says you have to be 18 to enjoy the rights that are bestowed by the First Amendment. There is also something called the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, which admittedly has not been signed by the United States, much to our shame, but has been signed by almost every country in the world, which specifically guarantees children the rights to both consume and disseminate information in any media. And it really, I mean, there's just no ambiguity that it protects the rights for children to be online. Now, that's not arguing that a 4-year-old should have access to hardcore pornography. There obviously has to be some common sense. I hope I'm not violating your trademarks in using that term, common sense.
100% agree with you.
With a small c, small s. But nevertheless, I think we really have to be very, very careful that children's agency, children's free speech rights, and their rights to access important information, including healthcare information, is protected by any legislation that we pass.
Thank you, Larry. Matt, please, yeah.
Yeah, I just kind of added that, like doubling down on the children's rights piece. Like, I don't think that gets talked about a lot in the law, and that so much of online safety has been about how do we protect children. And the harms, in particular, if you look at anything around age assurance or other stuff, a lot of the harms to talk about are usually adult content, grooming, or any type of sexploitation, but also additional harms, eating disorder content, suicide, self-harm of some kind, or even violent extremist content. And for young people, majority of young people, I think everyone agrees, like, we want to limit access to that. But the piece that kind of gets excluded with the children's right part is what is their right to have access to it. Like, phones and technology become such a huge part of our culture, how we access learning materials, how we gain knowledge, connection with friends. We talked about, COVID. COVID really forced us into a time of how we connect and socially interact with other individuals for at least 2 years of our lives. And so within that, now we're trying to almost roll back the carpet, as it were, of we need to not do that as much. And so for young people who feel like, oh, I want access to this material, or I want to be able to communicate with my friends, that piece kind of gets obscured. The other piece I haven't touched on too is, we're definitely getting this is a tough issue to resolve, but trying to operationalize this, thinking about the tooling that's behind it, how do we enforce it, who's defining the policy, how are we defining harmful, those are things that I think for now platforms have been put in a position to define on their own, or lean into groups like the UN or other expert group like NEDA, National Eating Disorder Awareness, the groups who specialize in this content, in order to give definitions on how platforms should proceed in that. And so when we know that so much of this content is pervasive and kids have access, trying to limit that, trying to connect to the right resource, definitely becomes a challenge in terms of like, how do you enforce that? How do you enforce that consistently? And can you enforce that as an absolute? Can you guarantee 100%, 200%, whatever it is? So a lot of variables there.
Thank you. And I'm curious, Nicole or Holly, because the issue of privacy versus safety isn't necessarily unique to the age-appropriate design code. I actually think that we've seen this in quite a few bills and pieces of legislation that have either been passed and joined, but this battle between privacy and safety. So I'm curious if there's a response to some of these concerns as it relates to the age-appropriate design code or other pieces of legislation, and how a path forward can be made in some of these other bills, whether it's the age-appropriate design code or beyond.
Yes, I think that the concern that we're hearing about content and access to content is one that I'd like to really address, because there's nothing in the age-appropriate design code that is limiting a child's access to content. In fact, if a 14-year-old child wants to find eating disorder information, they're unfortunately going to find it with the age-appropriate design code. What age-appropriate design code is saying is that you have to design the platform so it's not amplifying that message, and you're looking out for those harms to children by those messages. So it's not limiting access to content, and that's something that we just continue to hear from big tech. That's not what the age-appropriate design code is really about. It's really about that amplification, the design features that are being used by these platforms with algorithmic feeds, endless scrolling, that are really making the platforms so addictive to kids. And so I think that that's something that I would really like to address. And Nicole, do you have anything further?
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say that, so thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
So, you know, one of the things that we're seeing in states that are following California, despite the lawsuit and rolling out the kids code, is a lot of clarifications in the language that the bill is not about content. The bill is not about parental consent. The bill has to ensure that children's rights are protected, right? So that language is in there, which is something, I'm not super excited that Net Choice sued, but I guess we can take some lessons, learn some things, and really clarify the language as we move forward. So a lot of the concerns I think that you raised, Larry, like our states are trying to address them and make the kids code, wherever it gets rolled out, more stronger against legal attack, right? So that's one thing. And then you raised, you know, the I can't even say operationalize, thank you. I think the code is a pretty pragmatic approach. There is a right to cure, there's substantial compliance. You know, there's all of these things where it was intended to be a little bit more flexible because it is a framework. It wasn't intended to be overly prescriptive. And so that right to cure is a really important part of that. In the UK, they're not quite as litigious, right? There's a lot of interaction with the enforcement agency, and so the right to cure was intended in California and all the other states that have rolled this out to make it more flexible for businesses. So it's not meant to be punitive. As far as the UN rights of the children, yes, it is very disappointing. Actually, the U.S. has signed, has not ratified.
Have not ratified. I'm sure what that means, but yes.
But, you know, the code it was inspired in the UK where these rights are respected, and, you know, I think that the authors and sponsors tried to do the same thing in California and in the other states. And so to the extent that that needs to be further clarified, I don't think any of the proponents of the bill are thinking that it's somehow going to infringe on kids' rights, but I think further clarification could be helpful. Oh wait, I forgot one more thing.
Please.
The tension between privacy and safety. There's always a tension between privacy and safety, right? The most safe thing you can do is probably to surveil kids all the time, and the most privacy protective thing you can do is to have none of that. And so if we want to enhance kids' online experiences and make them safe and private, you have to walk a line, and it has to be nuanced.
Thank you. And that's a perfect segue to my next question. In building on the conversation between privacy and safety, one of the innate features of the internet is that it is private, and that is a benefit to a lot of people. We were just discussing how some people need to access information, whether it's related to their reproductive health or whether it's related to their gender identity. However, that also makes it extremely difficult to find perpetrators of egregious material such as child sexual abuse material. California recently introduced a bill, SB 933, which updates existing child sexual abuse material, or CSAM, material to include artificial intelligence, CSAM material that was created with using artificial intelligence, and ensuring that that is encompassed in the law with the growing concern of generative AI as it relates to CSAM. So Matt, I know All Tech is Human and Thorn worked with industry to put out some guiding principles related to CSAM and the increase in the Gen AI as it relates to it. I would love for you to speak to that new report and speak to some of that.
Yeah, everyone's favorite topic, Gen AI. The purpose of the bill, as we started to see over the past year, in spite of efforts, NCMEC, National Center for Exploited Missing Children, has seen an increase in reports coming in of exploitative material, CSAM content. And with Gen AI, you now have a machine that can create exponentially more content, often manufactured, and there sadly are not legal requirements behind it because it's considered a newer image. It's not a real person, it's a manufactured image, which makes it hard to kind of prosecute under existing laws. And so the approach there's been big efforts around safety by design globally, not just here. And a lot of the platforms that joined, so Thorn has initially did a lot of work on human trafficking and now in online sextortion and prevention. All Tech is Human, Responsible Tech, Safety by Design. And so we partnered with multiple large platforms, OpenAI, Microsoft, Meta, just to name a few, really looking at what are the safety by design principles that platforms, particularly AI using platforms, can implement to keep this material from spreading, getting created in the first place, or being used to exploit individuals. Because even if it's a generated image, the harm that comes from that is just as real if it was a real image. And we've seen this with young people, we've seen this with adults. In California in 2015, I think, we had the first revenge porn law. Back then, now non-consensual image sharing. So we've seen efforts. We know how this can be damaged to socially and emotionally damaging and cause trauma to an individual. Gen AI is now can be used in the same way. So looking for ways to sort of create friction and stem and reduce the amount of content being created, reduce the amount of content being used to exploit individuals. The next phase of this is kind of what we're touching on now. It's one thing to make an open promise, like I'm going to do this. Like I tell my kids, like I'm mowing the lawn today, and then I go hang out with my friends, right? Now it's talking about how do we make sure platforms are doing this, and I think that's where regulation can play a key role in terms of how we sort of back in and support that this is what's really happening. And so this initiative, if you want to check it out, it's on the website, AI Principles. It's just a very good way in terms of what platforms are doing to keep this content from being spread and how to keep young people safe and keep individuals safe who use these AI platforms.
And Holly, if I recall your background
Yes.
such as this, please
Yes.
speak to it.
So I failed to mention that prior to coming to Common Sense Media, I was a Internet Crimes Against Children prosecutor for many, many years in Chicago, and then did some work at the DOJ prior to coming to Common Sense. So I definitely have a background in Internet Crimes Against Children, these harms that Matt's talking about. So I was really delighted to hear that I think that Tech supported the CSAM AI bill, which is really, really great. I think it's a really great step forward. I think with generative AI in particular, guardrails really need to be put in place. I think we've learned with social media and the fact that there wasn't a lot of regulation around social media for the past 20 years, that now is the time to actually put these guardrails in place for AI and generative AI. So at Common Sense Media, we are sponsors of Assemblymember Bauer Kahan's, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Sorry, Assemblywoman. But we are very strong supporters of her generative AI bill, putting these guardrails in place. We think that's a really, really great step for generative AI in California, and another opportunity for California to be a leader in tech policy.
So we just talked about some of the ways that we can address online safety through legislation. And I think we could all really agree that also digital literacy is extremely important. So I'm curious about some other ways that we can ensure that kids and families know not only their rights, but also can help guard themselves, and we can all be more informed about how to use social media, about protecting ourselves on social media. So I wanted to throw that out there to anyone who'd like to start.
I'd like to chime in, but before I
Please
want
do.
to make a comment about the safety versus privacy.
Please do.
A huge factor in the encryption debate, and I actually am part of a consortium with the Internet Society where we're trying to explore the ways in which encryption can actually help protect children, because there is this presumption that and by the way, I spent 20 years on the board of NCMEC, so I have a very strong background in child protection and fighting CSAM and child exploitation, but at the same time, the very technology which unfortunately may make it easier for some criminals to evade prosecution for exploiting children can also be used to protect the privacy of children and the security of children. And so, while not necessarily wanting to open up a can of worms and debate encryption right now, that's another example where you really have to look at the unintended consequences of what on the surface seems like an obvious thing. Yeah, we should open it up for law enforcement. Well, aside from the constitutional issues, there are actually safety issues. But to get to your question, having been in the business of internet safety education now for 30 years, I know that sounds bizarre, but in 1994, 30 years ago, I wrote a booklet called Child Safety on the Information Highway for NCMEC. It was the very first popular booklet or piece of literature on how to stay safe online, and NCMEC printed, I think, millions of copies of it over a number of years. And I've been doing this ever since then. It's real clear to me that we still have a lot of work to do, that there needs to be, and I really think, for those of you who are on the state legislature or working with state legislators, ought to be thinking about mandatory internet education in the schools I think, maybe even from kindergarten, given the fact that there are many very young children who at least have access to tablets these days. So internet safety education is so critical. There's a technology that really concerns me. There's a technology that injures 400,000 young people every year in America and kills about 300 people every year. And we could argue that it should be banned, but I sure as heck would hate to see bicycles taken off the market. Oh, I love bicycles. I'm a bike rider myself. I rode a bike when I was a child. My children rode bicycles. But California has a law that requires children to wear helmets, not to mention all sorts of traffic laws that require all bicycle riders to ride reasonably safely, as well as laws that require motorists to respect the rights of bicyclists. So we need to think about how we can educate people, both through laws, but also through the kind of work that FOSI does, the kind of work that Common Sense does, the kind of work that Connect Safely does. I'm not sure how much education All Tech as Humans doing, but I know that these three organizations do a lot of work in terms of educating parents, young people, educators, and policymakers as to internet safety. And we have, at Connect Safely, guides to every major platform, including Roblox, I should add, since we have the Vice President of Civility of Roblox in the room, but also TikTok and Snapchat and Instagram and Discord and many other services that are out there that kids use. That's very important. But as hard as we work, we can only scratch the surface. I would estimate that if you took all three organizations combined, we're still probably in the single digits in terms of the number of people we can actually reach on a direct basis in America. If not the single digits, the low double digits. We need to make it the triple digits. 100% of kids need to be educated on terms of how to use this technology safely. 100% of parents need to understand how the technology works. They don't have to be, totally versed in the intricacies of the tech. I don't even know how pistons work in automobiles, but I know how to drive a car. And I just think there's so much work that needs to be done. And NGOs, nonprofits are doing a great job, but we can't do it alone. We need the schools, we need the government, we need the tech sector to double down on education.
Thank you. We'd love for someone to follow up. Thank you, Matt. Nicole?
So when I started teaching, phones had just entered the classroom. Phones with keyboards, right? Like that was the new novelty. And as a teacher, like one of the first things you learn is classroom management. There wasn't a day that went by, like you did the yawn stretch, or the getting a pencil out of your backpack 5 times because they're text someone and they're like, hey, what are you doing with that phone? Like, oh, I'm just texting my mom. Like that was like the patent answer. And I remember telling my dad, I'm like, hey, like these kids are on their phones. I can't teach the class. I'm like really annoyed. And he starts laughing at the phone. I'm like, why are you laughing? And he's just, I can't believe kids are doing that. I'm like, doing what? My dad started teaching in 1967. We both taught high school English. And I said, what are you laughing about? Like, doing what? And he's like, well, just getting away with stuff. And that was kind of like my first insight into young people and just life is, when it came to tech, is like, kids are as good with tech as socially enhance their lives. And we hear a lot, particularly from adults, are like, those kids, those digital natives are so good with this tech. And I did a lot of experience in my teaching career, and they're not, right? They're good with the things that enhance or add value to their life. And one of the challenges that I faced those early days is there weren't a lot of resources online. I think eventually there's several large platforms published a learning library. And this is like almost 15, 20 years ago now. But I know from later on talking to these same groups that no one measured any data. Who was accessing it? What were they asking? How are accessing any of that stuff? And so in schools, at least for me as a teacher, I started looking for a curriculum, whether like Common Sense has been around for a while, and just trying to find something that I could have these conversations. And the one conversation that doesn't happen at a large scale is why. As I hear like AI came out, Gen AI had like 2 days of, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And then by the third day, it was the uncle you couldn't get to leave Thanksgiving dinner. And within that time, all of a sudden you see it getting banned, schools not giving access, kids are going to cheat. Everyone went to the worst case scenario. But no one thought about like, well, what is the why? If kids are cheating with their phones, why do we have conversations about this versus let's just block it? I mean, I could tell you in 2008, I was going to schools, over 100 schools in the United States. Every single one had a same image of a BlackBerry-looking black and white phone with a red line and a circle over it. And I would be in an assembly with 1,800 students, and there would be kids out there with their phones out during the assembly. They didn't get the why, and it obviously wasn't being enforced. And so as we think about the why, the second piece to that, embedding education has to be in everything. So one of the things I learned as a teacher is how do you eliminate the excuse? Right? It's not enough that I put a poster up on a wall, but am I talking about it in class? Am I talking about it in every class? Am I talking about how these things interconnect to my subject learning, how I can advance my learning, how I can use it to elevate my educational experience, to take notes, to create a project? Just being able to have that conversation and reinforce it on a consistent basis with the understanding that kids are going to screw up. They're young. If you have a teenager who's perfect, write a book, run them for president, they're amazing. But until that moment comes, we need to talk about the why. We need to embed learning opportunities in every experience that comes along. We need to look at new opportunities. First time you get a phone, what's wrong with going to Verizon and AT&T, at T-Mobile, and when you get a phone, you do like a half-hour class just like you would do for driving, and you get $50 off your phone, right, by doing the safety course. There are a lot of things and avenues we haven't looked at yet that I think provide opportunities to learn, to discuss, and have the conversation. And particularly for parents, a lot of parents are just like, well, I'm just not that good with tech. No, but you have great human experience. You've lived a life. You've had friends. You've had good relationships and bad relationships. You know what it's like to be human. Talk about your kids in that context, because the social interactions they're having online are similar to what you're doing. They're just taking place in a different venue. So how do you create those opportunities to have those conversations? Because if they don't get it at home, they're going to get it from friends. If they don't get it from friends, they're going to get it online. They're going to find somewhere to find the thing that they want to do.
The one thing I would add about digital citizenship is, of course it's important. Of course parents need to know things, kids need to know things. We all need to know how to operate these devices and what's going on. But no parent is a match for the greatest software engineers in the world. And no kid is a match for that. And so I think a lot of the time when we talk about digital citizenship, we see things like parental consent, parental controls, all of these things happening. And without actual regulation of the platforms themselves, those things don't mean anything, right? Because the product will keep changing, the way kids are being exploited will keep changing, so you need both of those things to happen at the same time. And that's why I think laws that are solely based on parental consent and parental monitoring fall short, because the companies are developing their own tools for parents to monitor kids. But they're clearly, unless forced to, not going to cut into their bottom line, right? And so those tools aren't all that effective. When the CCPA was passed, there are special protections for kids in the CCPA, but when it was passed, I mean, you could only control the sale of your data. You couldn't prevent people from collecting your data, right? And that was, a big oversight. And those are the kind of parental controls and monitoring we see and the consent we see. One of the things that really bothers me about COPPA, and it desperately needs to be updated, is that I'm pretty sure under COPPA you could consent to the harmful use of your kids' data. Consent models don't work, and so talking about digital citizenship without talking about putting the onus on tech companies to make their products private and safe as well, I think is misguided.
I think that it's really important to think about, I'm from Common Sense Media, so I'm going to talk to you about digital citizenship, and I'm happy to do that. But I think it really is like a, three-legged stool of the digital citizenship, the robust research that our organization does, and that's why we support some of the regulation that we support, like Skinner's his social media youth addiction law, which is backed up by research that Common Sense Media did about the over 250, I think on average, notifications that a girl from 11 to 17-year-old female would receive throughout the day. That is an average. So that law puts a limit on when notifications can be received, so that notifications can't be received from midnight to 6 a.m., but that's research backed because we know that these notifications are being received by children. So I think that, again, that digital citizenship is really important. Research is really important to see like what's actually happening in classrooms, what's actually happening to these kids, listening to these kids, but also the regulation is really, really important and needs to be the backstop for families and for kids.
Thank you. And I think we talked about how we can use education to empower ourselves. We talked about what legislators and policymakers can do to implement some of this legislation. So now I'm curious, with some of this legislation being passed, it immediately has a lawsuit that comes about afterwards, and then it gets enjoined. But what is the path forward? Where do we see either California or, and this is an issue that expands beyond California, going in addressing this issue? So I think for each of our speakers today, in just 30 seconds, like where would you like to see California move in addressing online safety, and even California and beyond? Where is the movement going? And I'm happy to start at the end and move this way, or how do you?
All the pressure.
Sure.
I do think age assurance is the new thing that's facing us. The debate between safety and privacy is going to amplify. It is very much worth asking what's happening with our data, where is that data going, who is collecting it. You're hearing that take place in open forums, whether it's TikTok and ByteDance in China, whether it's Meta, pick a platform, right? I think it's something that we should all ask. But the age assurance one, harmful content, I really think those are like the next big debates. Historically, particularly harmful content targeted youth is one of those areas that tends to have a very strong nonpartisan poll where everyone's just like, bad stuff to kids, like, yeah, let's support that. So I really think those debates are going to be accelerated the next couple of years. And we're seeing that internationally, right? Online Safety Act in the UK, other states as part of the DSA, certainly the E-Safety Commission in Australia. So California is like right on the forefront of those conversations.
Yeah, I agree. Although I'm not super excited about that's where it's going. I think we're in a moment right now, kind of like the moment we were 20 years ago, 15 years ago with social media, and we didn't get ahead of it. We're having that same moment right now with AI, and I would love California, with all of the expertise that is here, to really think about what existing frameworks we already have in place. So the harms aren't necessarily new, right? But the tool, the method of harming kids, that's what's new, and that's the technology. And we already have these frameworks in place, and to the extent that we can modify existing tort law, we can modify existing duties of care to make sure we encompass not only the technologies of today, but the technologies of tomorrow. I think we can get out ahead of this whole thing and not be in the same situation that we've been in for the past decade, where we've been trying to, play defense with social media instead of offense.
When I think about social media, you mentioned going back 20 years to social media. I want to go back probably more than 100 years to the invention of the automobile. I wasn't around then. I don't know what Henry Ford was thinking when he started, automating the production of automobiles. But my guess is that he wasn't putting a great deal of thought into pollution, climate change, gridlock, carnage on the highway, and all of the other negative things that have happened as a result of the automobile. If someone were to start a car company today, imagine, I would imagine that the engineers and the marketing people want the car to look really good and go really fast and be fun to drive. Oh, darn it, the government wants us to put in airbags, brakes. We have to do that? Yeah, you got to do that. You don't release a car even on day one that doesn't have airbags and brakes. Yet in the world of tech, sorry, it's my doorbell ringing at home. It's crazy. In the world of tech, startups can just go ahead and produce products and then lock the barn door after several horses have been stolen and injured. I mean, I can't tell you how many cases over the last 20 years almost that Connect Safety has been around when we have heard from companies who have reached out to us because they had a crisis, because there was a suicide or there was some horrible thing that happened, and they needed to change their policies to prevent these from happening again. So, when we talk about safety by design, it has to be from day zero with every product from every company, including startups. I've actually met with some venture capitalists trying to get them to build this into their funding mechanisms. I've gotten nowhere with this, but hope springs eternal. Having said that, there is a difference between cars and social media, and the difference is speech. And because of speech, there are going to be both impediments to doing the right thing, like perhaps some of the injunctions and other lawsuits that are going on, as well as the necessity to make sure that as we put these laws and regulations and policies into place, that we think about the First Amendment, we think about the rights of children. I don't want to be a broken record, but it does make it more complicated than building a car or building any other device, because speech is so integral to the nature of the way technology is being used. So I don't, smarter minds than I can come up with specific legislation, but I do agree. When I walk into a restaurant, I don't go back and inspect the kitchen. I trust the fact that there are government-employed safety people who go around at least once in a while and make sure that this restaurant is obeying the health laws. And that allows me to go to all sorts of restaurants, famous ones, unknown ones, holes in the wall, taco trucks, you name it, because all of them are subject to the same or roughly the same legislative requirements that they treat food safety seriously. And I do want that from social media. I do want that from AI. I do want that from devices like our smartphones. So I think it's time that Silicon Valley drop its historic objection to any form of regulation, and that's happening. Even Mark Zuckerberg famously agreed that we need legislation. I'm not sure we would all agree with his definition of the legislation, but at least we all agree that it's needed. So I think it's time for Silicon Valley to loosen up a little bit and recognize the fact that with great power becomes not only great responsibility, but great accountability, and that's where government steps in. But it's also important that government, A, not stifle innovation, A, not micromanage to such extent that they are going to make it impossible for companies to adapt to changes in technology over time, but at the same time, think about how they protect the population, children, and the rest of us.
Yes, I couldn't agree more with a lot of what you just said there. So, and the rest of my panelists, I think that, like you were saying about the kitchen and not going in and inspecting the way that the kitchen's being run because there's legislation, I think that's the problem. How we found ourselves in this space right now is that for the past 20 years, parents have thought that regulation, that the space was being regulated. And I really think that it wasn't until COVID, in talking to parents and, just this huge momentum right now behind parents and legislators to create this change. I think that people didn't realize that there was no regulation. Parents didn't realize that. And then all of a sudden, we got Facebook papers and we had revelations about what was happening at these companies, and nothing was being done to regulate them, and that's why we're here today. So I think that moving forward, we really need to make sure, like I said, I don't want to sound like a broken record either, but I think putting in common sense regulations that are going to help put guardrails in place for AI, for that development, I think is going to be really important. I think that California has an opportunity to take a lead in establishing vetting platforms or vetting processes for AI products that are going to be released especially to children. But I think that arguably there could be a vetting process for all AI products, but especially those that are reaching children. Those products need to be vetted. There needs to be some sort of guardrails in place for them. before they become our next social media crisis.
Thank you so much, and I think that aligns very perfectly with FOSI's mission of our 3 Ps, incorporating industry best practices, enlightened public policy, and good digital parenting. So I would like to pause briefly and open it up for questions from our audience, and then we feel free to ask. Please direct it to either one panelist or the entire panel. And if we don't, I have tons of questions, so happy to continue the conversation. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Maria Conicelli with FOSI. I'm just curious, obviously we're seeing states across the country doing many different things in regards to proposed legislation, everything from, age-appropriate design code in California to age verification requirements, parental consent, data privacy. Is there, in your opinion, one model that should be prioritized? What's the best approach? Is it a combo of a number of different things? And what do you see as the pros and cons of all of these different states doing different things?
I can start there. I really do think that the age-appropriate design code is the great model. We'll actually see tomorrow, hopefully, knock on wood, Maryland Kids Code is going to be signed into law in Maryland by Governor Moore in Maryland. And that was a code that was drafted largely off of the California Age-Appropriate Design Code, but also taking into consideration the lawsuits and joining the California Kids Code, or Age-Appropriate Design Code. So, those definitions of harms you see that more in Maryland. And so I think that model is something that can really, really be used. We also see it being used in Minnesota and Vermont as well, to create some meaningful legislation that's going to help with age-appropriate design. I think that it needs to be the design, because I don't think that banning kids are going to find ways to get around that. So if you tell kids, you can't have someone that's under 13 on a platform, they're going to figure out a way to get around that. So the platforms just need to be designed for a 13-year-old to be on the platform. So I think that that's really my opinion.
And I have a follow-up. Oh, Matt, did you have a response?
Yeah, no, I think it's just I'm glad from just an enforcement that, if the age-appropriate design code is kind of the standard, right? We've seen that with the Online Safety Act in the UK, and invariably platforms will look for the law that's most restrictive and plan for that. Because trying to plan 50 different experiences through 50 different states and then to gatekeep around that is very cumbersome and demanding of engineers. And so anything that helps get at least some regulatory consistency then makes it easy to kind of drive policy, develop those best practices, and then start to enforce consistently. So
I can think of laws I don't like the one that just was signed by Governor DeSantis in Florida, which essentially bans children under 14 from social media and requires parental consent, I believe, for children 14 through 16. I think that those are non-starters for a lot of reasons, including the fact that kids will find a way around that, including finding sites that don't enforce the law, that don't care about what laws Florida or any other state may have passed. So it's sort of easier to tell you what I don't like than what I do like, but I do think that of all the legislation I've seen, I am most impressed with both the UK and the California design codes as getting to the root of the problem, thinking about it from this standpoint. Again, like the car, the airbags, like the bicycle helmets, that you've got to build in to the product as much safety as you can, and at the same time, and I'm glad that Maryland has passed a law that takes into consideration the First Amendment. I haven't looked at the Maryland law, but I presume that it's obviously, if it's not dealing with the whole net choice issue, takes into consideration some of the speech issues. I think that's the way to go. And I think we just need to, again, always think about the unintended consequences. Every time that anybody looks at a law, there needs to be a list of all the reasons why you want to sign it and all the reasons why you might want to amend it because of what it does that may do more harm than good, or may do harm in addition to good.
If I could just follow up on that
Yeah.
too. Clearly, it has to be a multifaceted approach, right? It can't just be one thing. not to get into the nitty-gritty, but the age-appropriate design codes, like, there are business size thresholds, right? It doesn't apply to everyone right now. In a lot of states, it's not gonna apply to the education sector as much as it should. And so, you know, and it's not device level specific. Like, there are lots of things that we could be doing to enhance kids' safety that are built into the design in different ways, not just the age-appropriate design code. I think the problem we are seeing from a lot of states is that there's a lot of parental consent bills, and as we discussed earlier, like, that doesn't solve the problem. Like, that's not part of the multifaceted approach unless we're talking about very young children.
So I don't want to take away from another question in the room, but I did have a follow-up to Maria's question, the patchwork of these online safety bills. We've also seen this in privacy, and California has what is considered one of the most robust data privacy, consumer privacy laws in the country. And our panel today is called that California has a golden opportunity or a unique opportunity to address online safety. So does California's privacy law make it just a different state rather, and separate it from the rest of the states, given its robust privacy law? So does it make things like the age-appropriate design code? Does it lower the stakes, for example, for the age verification measure that's a part of it? So I'm curious if California's privacy law makes some of these other pieces of legislation that we're seeing, does it enhance them? Does California have this unique opportunity that we're talking about?
Having worked on the CCPA and the AADC, I can say that I think the AADC was easier to pass in California because a lot of the debates over the definitions in the comprehensive privacy law had already been had, right? Like, the AADC is already very comprehensive, it's large, they were new concepts, so it was hard for legislators to wrap their minds around, but what they didn't have to wrap their minds around was the definition of personal information or the enforcement or any of these things. So I do think there's a benefit to having a comprehensive data privacy scheme in place. And I will also say that in the other states, most of the other states that have passed comprehensive data privacy is largely based off of California's CCPA. In Maryland, they were passing a comprehensive data privacy was going through at the same time as the kids code. Same thing in Vermont and Minnesota. So the legislators were all grappling with these ideas at the same time. And it is easier, I think, to get to the substance of the problem and the solution if you kind of have that comprehensive data privacy scheme in place.
And potentially a conversation for another time is the potential for a federal privacy law,
Right.
Which will impact all of the states. So I just want to take this time to thank all of you for participating in this panel. I want to thank our speakers for participating in FOSI Briefs the States, a golden opportunity for online safety. Thank you so much for coming, and we appreciate you.